Hello, everyone from St. Mary's College. Um, this is going to be an interesting experience for the next 6 weeks. I hope that these videos can help um, sort of replace some of the lectures that I've been doing, and you can hear, some explanations and some more in-depth talking about some of the topics besides just the reading. So we will be doing these videos. I'll be breaking them into smaller sections so that's not an extremely long video that you have to sit through. Um, but you will not always be seeing my face because I don't really want to be on camera the whole time. So mostly you'll be seeing the slides and hearing my voice. I hope that you all are doing well and are safe, taking care of yourselves, both physically and mentally. We're all under a lot of stress. So just be doing the best that you can. That's all you can do. So anyways, from here on out, we'll be finishing the next section of Chapter 6, Diversity and Social Justice, as we didn't finish that before break. Please email me or let me know if you have any questions about the course or about the PowerPoints or anything like that. All right, here we go. All right, so for the first part of class, we've been talking about the first force, the second force, the third force, and we're finally at the most current and most recent force, which is the multicultural view of psychology, and in particular, when we're thinking about counseling. So again, like I've mentioned, this started in the 80s and 90s and really has been growing since then. This is the most dominant force now. And there's been a lot of research in counseling psych on multicultural issues. As your book mentioned, there are a variety of different multicultural issues that have been researched, things like class, immigration status, just as some examples. But really the three that have had the most research are sex and gender, which we've already covered. So that includes things like sexism. We talked about objectification theory and gender roles and things like that. Next, race and ethnicity. And then we've also, in counseling psych, done a lot of work on sexual orientation. Now, it doesn't mean the other social identities, class, and so on haven't been researched, but these are the areas that have been researched the most, so where we're going to spend most of our time. And like I mentioned, we've already covered sex and gender in class on the Wednesday before spring break. So we started race and ethnicity, so I'll do a brief review there and go into more depth on that, and then create another video for the final section on sexual orientation. So as noted in class, there's been a lot of research in counseling psychology on race and ethnicity. And just to define some of these concepts quick, race refers to an assigned category based on physical characteristics. This is often based on skin and hair color, but it's not clearly defined. And part of that is because the ideas of what a quote race is has changed across time. If we think back, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, people and groups that we would consider white now, like Irish and Italian, were not considered white then. And so we know that race and ideas of race have changed across different time periods, and it also changes across different cultures. So for example, when I lived in Brazil, the way that Brazil views race is very different than the way that the US views race. And there are different racial categories and so on. However, just because it's not clearly defined does not mean that it doesn't affect people. Race has a huge impact on people's lives and impact on society. And so one way that psychologists look at race is this idea of someone's racial identity, how they view oneself as a racial being, and how this changes across time, across situations, and so on. And so the fact that the importance or the salience of one's race can vary based on situation shows that salience of one's racial identity can change. So an example of this is if you can think about a time where you were amongst a large group of people and were one of the only people of a different race in that group. Perhaps your salience of your race was pretty high in that moment, but if you're around people of a similar race than you, you aren't thinking about your race as much as you were if you were around people different than you. So this, salience is one area of racial identity that has been researched. Next is ethnicity. So ethnicity and race are often conflated in popular culture, sort of viewed as the same thing. But in psychology, ethnicity is more about one's culture of origin or sense of belonging to a certain group. So this would be one's ethnic identity. And this is also sort of hard to define, but it usually has to do with either one's language or common shared culture or some connection to a culture, a few generations back. So people might identify their ethnicity as Korean American or Mexican American or Irish American or so on, or Nigerian American. So these sort of ethnic um, groups sort of refer to maybe a culture of origin or a nation of origin or a language of origin. Um, and in the US right now, I mean, there are many, many different ethnic identities. The only one that the census tracks is Latino or Hispanic ethnicity. So our racial identities and ethnic identities do not operate in isolation. We live in a society that for generations and years has um, stratified people, privileged people, oppressed people based on race. And when people act and believe and behave in ways that are tied to these systems, this is what we sort of consider racism. Now, racism can operate on many levels. It can be individual people doing or acting in racist ways, but it can also be larger. It can include systemic um, issues that are operating more on the systemic level. And we call this institutional racism. So these are the ways that a variety of institutions can give opportunities to some racial groups, give privileges to some racial groups while not giving those advantages to others. So it'll privilege some groups, disadvantage other groups, and so on. And there's a variety of different ways that institutional racism has taken place and continues to take place. One way is that the way that our school systems are funded. They're based on the income of that school district. So if a certain school district is in a poorer area, for example, they're going to have less resources than a wealthier school district. And then there's a whole variety of racial components that also can play into this. Another way that institutional racism might look is the ways that banks, colleges, other institutions, for example, with banks, have given loans to white individuals at higher rates than people of color. And these issues, these systems, I mean, compound and complexify the issue of race in the US and so on. And so in counseling psych, we look at the ways that racism can affect people. The impact of racism in people's lives, the impact of institutional racism in denying opportunities for individuals. So counseling psych really takes a broad look at racism and how it impacts people. And we'll talk about some of the specific things that they'll look at and research next. One area that psychologists and counseling psychologists have looked at is the idea of white privilege, which can be defined as unearned, invisible social power for white Americans in the US. This does not mean that white people have not struggled or faced challenges in their lives, but really what this means, if we look at a systemic level, overall, looking at generalizations across the US, white people are given greater access to resources. They escape penalties such as being discriminated against because of their race. And another example of white privilege might be how beauty standards and so on are often based upon white ideas of what is quote unquote beautiful. So there's a lot sort of wrapped up in this white privilege, and counseling psychologists attempt to, do studies on this to quantify what this is, how this impacts people, and so on. And looking at this again, this unearned, invisible social power. Another concept that psychologists study is this idea of colorblind racial ideology. And this type of ideology is an ideology that pretty much says, I don't see color. You may have heard people say, I treat everyone the same regardless of race. I don't care about if this person is X, Y, or Z. I treat them exactly the same. And on the surface, this can appear really humanizing or, promoting equality. But what psychologists have realized is that this also minimizes the importance of race and racism in people's lives. So this invalidates people's experiences of racism, invalidates their racial identity, and can really be harmful. And so psychologists have looked at this concept of colorblind racial ideology, done studies on the impact of what this means when people say things like, I don't see color. Another category of topics that psychologists look at when researching race and ethnicity are microaggressions. And microaggressions are subtle, often unintentional slights against people. And in this case, if they're racial microaggressions, it's often towards people of color. So these can look a variety of different ways. Oftentimes, they're not said with bad intentions, but over time, these microaggressions can build up and be really harmful. I'll often use the analogy of like it's like stubbing your toe. Like one little microaggression might not be all that harmful, just like stubbing your toe once. It's painful, but you get over it. But if you imagine like continuously stubbing your toe over and over again, it could get worse. It could, get break bones or whatever. I mean, it sort of builds on each other. So this is how psychologists have sort of looked at microaggressions. And again, they've designed studies to look at the impact of these and compared, for example, people who experience more versus less, and looked at the impact on mental health. So I'm going to show you some examples of microaggressions and colorblind racial ideology just that people have posted on the internet. This is from a project where people wrote about microaggressions they experienced. So in this example, someone is saying, Courtney, I never see you as a Black girl. And this is sort of driving the point home about the colorblind racial ideology. My guess is that someone who said this was trying to say, I don't see you any differently than anyone else. On the surface, again, that might be trying to promote equality, but really it's invalidating this person's experience as a Black person, as a Black girl in the US, and what that means. So this is sort of an example of both a microaggression and colorblind racial ideology. For this one, this person wrote, so like, what are you? And for people that are biracial or difficult to categorize by race, this might come up a lot. And I have a friend, for example, who was a flight attendant and is biracial, and she often gets passengers on her flight asking her, what are you? What are you? And this can be really dehumanizing, demeaning, just to hear this constantly of you're trying to put me in some box, and why is that really needed? So this could be another example of a microaggression. For this final example, this person wrote that she's heard, can you read this? And showed this person a Japanese character on his phone. So this person made a lot of assumptions just based on how this person looks, that they can read Japanese, maybe that they are Japanese. And again, these microaggressions just can build up and cause a lot of problems. It just can be really invalidating for a lot of people. So psychologists have done a lot of research on microaggressions. Other ideas and concepts that counseling psychologists study, another one would be xenophobia. This can be described as prejudice towards immigrants and those who are perceived as foreign, where they might be discriminated against, they might be denied jobs or things like this. I often, think about this even now as a lot of Asian Americans are experiencing discrimination with the coronavirus, as people sort of see this as a foreign agent. So xenophobia can have lots of different forms and affects anyone that really is perceived to be foreign. Acculturation is another concept that counseling psychologists study. They study that when people immigrate or move to a new culture, how people learn to adopt the behaviors and cultural traditions of the new culture. Um, Sometimes this is referred to as the host culture. And so acculturation, there's a lot of ways that people can acculturate or might acculturate. There's not one quote unquote right way of acculturating, but people have varying levels of acculturation and how much they maintain their home culture versus the new culture and so on. And typically for immigrants and children of immigrants, as people are longer in a country or a culture, they tend to have higher rates of acculturation versus if they are brand new to a culture. The final sort of piece of or concept that I'll talk about related to race and ethnicity are these racial and ethnic identity development models. So starting in the 80s or so, people started noticing that how people think about themselves as a racial being varies. Some people have very strong racial identity concepts. Other people have sort of weak racial identity concepts of themselves, self-concepts. And so various psychologists began studying how people um, develop this idea of themselves as a racial being. Um, and there's a lot of different ways they've done this for all the different sort of racial groups in the US and looked at how people might interact in their community, interact with themselves along regarding their racial identity. And the whole idea is that it's not static. So we aren't just, at one point in time thinking about ourselves, for example, for me as a white person, that's not going to stay the same. As I learn more about discrimination and racism, I might develop different ways about thinking about my own privilege and my own white identity. So there are these racial and ethnic identity development models that the book mentioned. It mentioned a couple of them. And then if you ever take multicultural psych, for example, we go into much greater detail in some of these models. So as a final just note about counseling psychology, this is just one study I pulled from the Journal of Counseling Psychology in 2010, looking at how Filipino Americans cope with racism and all the different ways that they're coping with discrimination, prejudice, and so on, and highlighting ways that they might be resilient or cope in the face of such difficulties such as racism. So this is just one study pulled out of the many, many studies in this journal and other counseling psychology journals that really are examining and studying race and racism. So this is where I'll end it for this video. The next video will talk about how counseling psychologists look at sexual orientation and wrapping up the chapter on diversity and social justice.